a little bit. I'm going to share some stats with you, but this isn't going to be a travel log. I'm not going to talk about each and every day and everything that I saw and all the things I learned. We'd be here for hours. And really what I want to share with you is some of the things that I've learned, some of the ways that your gift of a sabbatical to me has helped me become more whole and set me on a course that I look forward to journeying with you all. So it's kind of a warning, too, about here's what's coming, and it's all your fault. Okay? So the first thing, though, that I thought would be really fun to share with you, and that is really small. I didn't know I was going to be in the sanctuary, are some of the statistics from my trip. And so I took 4 different trains, most of them overnight trains. Only one of them was not an overnight train. I took a train from here to Seattle, the Empire Builder on Amtrak. And then I took a train from Salem, Oregon, down to LA. And that was also an overnight. That was just one night. The Empire Builder is 2. And then took one from Los Angeles down to Orange County, where my family was, and then took one from Emeryville, which is outside of San Francisco, to Chicago. And that was 3 nights, 4 days. I never thought I would want to get off a train as much as I did when we got there. I felt really badly for a couple that I met. It was their first train ride, and they were so looking forward to it, but they were both very tall and not used to being train travel, and they picked the longest route that Amtrak has. They were very much ready to get off of the train 2 days in. So anyways, 3 planes. I took a plane from Seattle to Anchorage, then Anchorage to Portland, but stopping over in Seattle. 2 cars, my car and my sister's car. We did quite a bit of driving, my sister and I. 32 hotels. Yeah. I took a train partly, and then when I was in California, my sister met me in Orange County, and we drove to her house in Visalia and did some traveling, and then went to San Francisco. And then when I came back in October, so I spent the first month, 5 weeks on trains, and then after that, I was in my car. Yeah. So I stayed at 32 hotels, 2 Airbnbs, 1 sister's house, and 1 cousin's house. So it was a lot of different beds. I will tell you, 95% of the hotels were Marriott hotels because I get Marriott Bonvoy points, and I'm now a platinum member of Marriott. So I'm going to milk that for everything it's worth this year because it won't happen again. And I came away realizing that I have horrible pillows. And so for Christmas, I got some of the Marriott pillows and love them so much. And so drove 7,766 miles. 6,700 of those were when I did the Civil Rights Trail in my own car. 34 cities, 30 states, 26 museums and libraries, 8 different tours, and 28 monuments and historic sites. Some of those national monuments, national sites, some of them not. And so it was a really full 3 months. And yet, it was also 3 months of renewal and rest. So that's why we're not going to go through each day, because there's a lot of things to talk about. But I am going to highlight a few things. And I've chosen to do it in this way. So I'm going to share some stories. I'm going to share some stories about Alaska. I'd never been to Alaska before, and I cannot wait to go back. And in Alaska, I remembered how important a connection to nature is for my own heart and soul. I'm going to talk about my train travels a little bit, and how that helped me connect to solitude and how important solitude is for me. Even though I am an extrovert, what Carl Jung taught us is that in our second half of life, we often lean into the opposite of our preferences. So leaning into the introverted side of myself and what that did for me. I'm going to talk a little bit about Disney and just how much and why I appreciate Disney for the connection that it provides, not only with other people, but with myself. I'm going to talk a little bit about my time in Atlanta and how I connected with discomfort and how important that is to learning. I'm going to talk about my time in Montgomery and a little bit of Birmingham. They kind of all, and Selma, they all go together, and talk about connection to past truth and past story. Memphis, I'm going to talk about connection to heartbreak. And Greensboro, connection to hope. When we were talking about Hope Restores today, I've known about Hope Restores since it opened, since it started, and I never connected that to how restoring hope is, if that makes any sense. And so I was thinking about hope is what restores us, and I love the name of that organization even more now. I'm going to talk a little bit about my time in Hartford and Ithaca, and talk about connection to family roots. And then Seneca Falls and Rochester, I'm going to talk a little bit about connection to feminine strength, and not only in those two places, but throughout my trip. That's what I hope to do. We may not get all that. And this isn't even a portion of it. As I was going through all the pictures, I'm like, oh, but there was this, and oh, there was that, but we'll figure it out. Now, most of you know I had COVID right after Christmas, right around Christmas and beyond, and so my brain isn't quite yet caught up to myself, and I was having issues with technology. And so this is the end of the slideshow, but I'm going to pull up pictures, I hope. Because if not, then it's not worth it. We might as well just go listen to Joel. So just give me a moment while I do this, and hopefully it does what I want it to do. That's not the picture I thought it was going to show me. Okay, oops. Okay. I love technology so very much. Enter full screen. Okay. Oh, no, you didn't. All right. Well, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to talk about all of those things. That's all train travel. And I'm just going to bring up pictures. And it's going to be a little bit disjointed, but that's okay. This is Alaska. So we're going to start with Alaska. That's where we were going to start. Oh, great. Okay. So when I was in Alaska, we stayed at, I went with Pastor Libby. She and I spent a week in Alaska, and we did lots of amazing things, and we stayed in this little cabin outside of Anchorage in a place called Girdwood. I loved it so much. I love the mountains. As much as I've always thought I'm a beach person, because I grew up in Southern California, I spent oodles of time in the beach. Really, where my heart kind of settles and relaxes is in the mountains. And so we stayed there, but then we went here, there, and everywhere around that. And one day we spent time in the fjords. And so this is part of it. This is a glacier, actually, that we actually got to see calf. So that's when parts break off of the glacier. And it was just starting that process. And so we saw some of it fall off of the iceberg, but then, or the glacier, but then we heard it, and the sound was so incredible. But what I loved so much about this trip, this tour, was seeing all the wildlife. It was one of the last tours of the season. So if you go to Alaska in September, go in the first half of September, not the second half, because in the second half, everything shuts down. And so we were there right as they were getting ready to end their season. And they were like, we're not sure how much wildlife we're going to see. And by the end, they're like, we haven't seen this much wildlife in months. So we saw orca whales, we saw porpoises, we saw jellyfish. Who knew? Jellyfish in Alaska. We saw seals and birds and all sorts of other things. And I just soaked it up. Like, there's so much joy in watching animals in their natural habitat and just taking it in. I finally just put my camera down because you couldn't get pictures of the 20 orca whales that were out, a quarter of a mile or wherever they were. You couldn't get good photos, and certainly not the porpoises who were racing the boat. So I just sat and just let myself be present in that moment and enjoy what is a part of God's nature, God's creation. And that was kind of the moment of just relaxing. Because the truth is, after 3 years of a pandemic, or 2 years of pandemic, however you're going to count it, I was pretty burnt out. And I was exhausted. Because the creative output that was required for us in that first year was more than it had ever been before. And there wasn't a lot of downtime, and there certainly wasn't a lot of face-to-face interaction time, which again, I'm an extrovert. I love seeing people face-to-face, which on a screen, I was thankful for that, but it wasn't the same. And so this gift of sabbatical was really an opportunity for me to step back, to step away so that I can rest and rediscover joy, which is exactly what happened. So, yay, thank you very much. Okay. Does that make sense? Any questions while I'm figuring out the next picture? Okay, let's see. Yes, we saw some puffins. Yeah. They were adorable. So this projector doesn't like these pictures, but that's me. In the train and leaving the lacrosse station, my family dropped me off. We went and had dinner at Waterfront is one of my favorite restaurants, so we went and had dinner in the tavern there, and then they dropped me off and took that picture of me waving from my roomette. That was my home for quite a bit of that first month. And I thought that I would go to the lounge car and that I would talk to my neighbors, and I did none of that. I sat in my little car and I read, not books for work, not books to help enrich my mind, but just novels. And it was delightful. And sometimes I even just sat and stared out the window. What I really enjoyed was mealtime, where I could come out of my little cocoon and sit with people and talk with them. Only one time was it super awkward, and that was with a woman from Canada, and she was traveling to California, and she asked me the question I hate always being asked: what do you do for a living? Not that I'm ashamed for what I do, but it often will do what it did with this woman, which is completely shut her down. And so then and I'm good at asking questions. I mean, this is what I do, right? So tell me more, right? So pulling questions out of her. Everybody else was delightful to talk to, and almost everybody asked me that question eventually, what do you do? I sat across the table from a couple. They were Jewish. I think they were from New York. So they were very stereotypical Jewish New Yorker. He was a psychologist, and he just went to town on asking. His wife was like, stop asking all these questions. I'm like, I love it, because they were really good, deep, thoughtful questions to ask a pastor, and he asked me, how do you deal with politics in your day? And so really good, deep questions. I had another conversation with a musicologist who taught at a school in Berkeley, at a university in Berkeley, and he mixes computer science with music and teaches how to do all of that. And I couldn't begin to explain it beyond that. He started talking to me about it, and I was like, I don't know. Let's talk about Bach. So really interesting questions, interesting people to meet, and I loved that. Because I don't often get a chance to sit down with complete strangers and just have conversations with them and hear about their lives and have them ask me questions about my life. And of course, then that helps me to reflect a little bit more. So there I am, 8 o'clock at night on my way to Seattle. It's much better on my computer. You can actually see my face. All right. So there we are waiting. These are, of course, you know Pastor Libby, and you know Eddie Kim, Dr. Kim. So they were two of the people that came and saw me off. Libby, of course, you know, is one of my travel partners. We travel a lot, and Eddie is becoming that person too. We are going to be going to Asheville, North Carolina at the end of this year for a swing dance event thing. I'm learning how to swing dance. Eddie is a very accomplished swing dancer, and so if you want to try something new and you want to get a little exercise, if those are some goals for you, I encourage you on Tuesday nights downtown La Crosse to come to a swing dancing class. It's an hour long. It's like $20. I can't remember now, but it's great fun. All ages, all abilities. So we're back to Alaska. This was a waterfall that the captain of our boat got us almost touching the wall. And so we were quite literally under the waterfall. And there was me and one other person like standing right there. And you can't see it, especially in this picture. But right about here, somebody had put a rubber ducky, so that was delightful. But just to sit and look up at the water and have it come down was magical. And then she got even a little closer, and I'm glad I backed up, because then water started pouring down the sides of the boat where lots of people were, and I didn't get wet, so I was very thankful for that. But that was one of my favorite moments on that tour. Just reminding me to be present in the moment, right? Like to not worry about, oh, I don't want to do that just yet. I really thought these would just go in the order I downloaded them. Let's go over here. That's my hotel in Atlanta. I don't know why that picture is there. Did not mean to share that one. Okay. So after I got home from the West Coast, I got into my car and I drove to North Carolina, where I started the Civil Rights Trail. So if you don't know, there is an official United States Civil Rights Trail that takes you through the South largely, but there are some places that are in the Midwest. There's some places that are a little farther north. But I used a book that gave an itinerary, because if you buy the official United States Civil Rights Trail book, it just tells you about the places, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. And so this other book, which I will bring with me next time, forgot to grab it. I'll bring it and have it in my office if you want to look at it. Gave an itinerary of how to travel, and not only what sites to see, but African American owned restaurants and stores, and they weren't all like civil rights museums, although I think I saw about 10 of those. But other kinds of things to do too, like jazz clubs, and the Blues Museum was a place that I went to, and all these kind of different sorts of things you can do. And so one of the things in Atlanta, a good chunk of the things that they had suggested in Atlanta were things that I have already done, because I've been to Atlanta quite a bit. And so the Civil Rights Museum that's there, I've done. The Martin Luther King things I've done. And so one of the optional things that you could do, there was always kind of, here's what you should do, and then here's a whole bunch of other things, was to do a tour of Atlanta that was focused not only on civil rights, but also on what's going on in Atlanta today. So not only what was going on before, but what's going on today. And so there were 8 of us on this little bus. Omar was our tour guide. I was the only white person that was on that tour bus. And I'd been to Charleston before Atlanta, and Charleston was completely different, because there were lots of lots of people traveling. The tour that I took in Charleston, there were maybe 2 Black people, and it was a civil rights-focused tour as well. So Atlanta was the first place where I started to feel other, where I was putting myself mostly in Black places, which was exactly what I wanted to do. And so it helped me lean into discomfort and to ask myself, why was I feeling uncomfortable? What was going on inside of me? What was going on around me? I was on that tour, and they would mention things, and I would have no clue what they were talking about. A lot of that had to do with pop culture things. Like, I knew historical things, but pop culture things, I had no idea. When Omar greeted me, he said, "Hi, family," which I discovered is a way that, especially African Americans, talk about beloved community, which is a concept that we hear most often associated with Martin Luther King Jr. And Coretta Scott King as they talk about what a beloved community is, which is all of us, community living together with justice and love, and everywhere, everyone's equal. And so to be welcomed that way was quite profound. And as much as I felt very much other, I felt very much a part of the group. Michael was my seat partner. He wasn't there with anybody else. Everybody else brought a friend, because that's how you normally would do these things, right? But he had been in town for the Pride Festival, and so he decided to do this. So he and I got to know each other very well. He's studying to be a social worker and a therapist, and so we had a lot to talk about. And this was the first time where I met someone when I told them what I did for a living was simply celebratory about it, that just loved the fact that I was a female preacher and that this was the work that I did. And that was consistent throughout my time with African American people. Not nearly that way when I was with white people. I don't know why. I don't know. So this was a mural that we saw on this tour. You see Dr. King in the center. You see Coretta Scott King next to him, Abernathy. Oh, I should know. Omar would be so disappointed in me. And then 2 others that I can't really recognize right now. And so we spent a lot of time driving around and talking about these greats, and then how that shaped Atlanta as a city. It was the first place I went where the building of stadiums and interstates was pointed out. And so then every other city that I went to, as I was in African American neighborhoods, almost, I would say every single one of them is bisected eventually by an interstate, or a stadium is placed there to disrupt the community. That's a problem. And we wonder why people are scattered and so desperate for community nowadays. Atlanta was also the place where I went to a restaurant. This was still early on, so I wasn't minding having my meals alone. About the second week in, I was tired of eating by myself. But I was at a Southern restaurant. I ate a lot of Southern food. By the time I got about 3/4 of the way through, I was dying for something other than fried Southern food, as much as I love it. I mean, I love it, but no more. A girl can only eat so much fried chicken and fried okra before she needs some Thai food or something. So, but I was seated, excuse me, I was seated in a small table, of course, because it was just me, and I was facing kind of their back room where a large group of people were, and the bar was right over here. And I must have sat there 10 minutes. Nobody was paying any attention to me. I didn't see anybody, no waiter came over. I could clearly see them waiting on other people. And I was feeling myself getting annoyed, and I'm like, it's okay. This is how African American people feel all the time. Just be present. And then a man, Lou, came from the big room, and he's like, "Are you sitting alone?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm traveling, so I'm by myself." He's like, "Well, that doesn't seem right." And I'm like, "Well, that's just, it's fine." And asked me to take a picture of him and his friends. I was happy to do that. I popped over to the bartender and said, "I'm not leaving," because of course I took my purse with me, because safety first. And I said, "I'm not leaving, I'm just going to go take a picture and then I'll be back." And then I got back to my table, took a picture of them, 12 men. They'd just seen a game. There was a huge game in the Falcons and the Washington Commanders that day. And then I sat back down, and then somebody came and got my drink order, somebody got my dinner order. And then Lou came back and sat and had a 20-minute conversation with me about whatever. He had just moved to Atlanta 2 years before that, was thrilled that I was a pastor. I can't remember what he was doing. I'm sure it's in my journal. But just to have him sit there and just have this conversation with me, and just because he's like, "You shouldn't be sitting by yourself." And I'll tell you, when he sat down, that's when people started helping me. So that was something to think about. So I love Atlanta, and I love my time in Atlanta because of the people that I met. I got to see, and it'll come up at some point, whole bunch of things. My favorite was the Tyler Perry Studios. I didn't know much about Tyler Perry, but he has been doing some amazing things in Atlanta as he has grown his own business and is reclaiming a lot of the neighborhoods in Atlanta. Okay. Questions? Thoughts? Yeah. If I had to venture a guess. Yes, so he asked if I could, if I had any idea why the Canadian woman that I had breakfast with shut down. And my sense was that, just from the conversation we had before that she was pretty, that her life was kind of rough, and that her job was to take rental cars from one place to another, and she talked about friends helping her get to this friend thing. So I imagine when she heard me talk about being a pastor, that brought, that she thought there was some judgment there. That would be my only guess. There's several different reactions that people have when they meet me. And it's either they feel like they have to tell me everything they've ever done wrong. They have to tell me how much they're not going to church, or how much they are going to church. People feel the need to justify themselves to me. And the reality is, if you're not one of mine, I don't care. You don't have to tell me. I don't judge people. We're all, even if you are one of mine, I know there's people like, "Oh, Pastor Karyn, I haven't been able to get to church for the last month." I'm like, life happens, right? But that's not the overarching story that's told about white preachers, typically. It's more the judgment kind of thing. So people just feel that need to confess all sorts of things to me. I don't know why that picture. Oh, you know what? I'm going to try something different here. Nope, that's the last one. Okay, let's go over here. So we're bopping all over the place. I'll figure this out the next time, so if you want to stay the next time, things will be a little bit more cohesive. When I finished the Civil Rights Trail, I finished in Washington, D.C., and my parents joined me there. And then we went up the coast to spend some time in Hartford, where my mom's maternal family is from. and Ithaca, where my mom's paternal family is from, doing family research. But we are very much in the Seneca Falls, Rochester area, where women's rights is kind of the birthplace of women's rights. And so this is from Seneca Falls, the fairly new national park there. And so we got to learn a lot about the women who started the right to vote for women. And I can make this bigger. This resolution is horrible. Anyway, so these are a few, but you'll notice, well, you can't really tell because he's in shadow, but on the very far right is Frederick Douglass. We did visit Frederick Douglass's house. If you ever want to do that, I highly encourage you to. It's outside of Washington, D.C. But please know to give yourself time because there are 87 steps that lead up to his house. His house is on the very top of a hill. We got there kind of late because traffic in D.C. was awful, not as bad as Boston. Boston broke me, but Washington, D.C. did not. So we ended up having to go up the steps. There's also a ramp that you can take all the way there. My parents were troopers. Like, we made it up there. We had a chance to catch our breath. It was great to hear about his life, and he was very much entwined with the women's rights, voting rights especially. He lived in Rochester for quite a long time. So that's why he's pictured there. He was there at the first convention that they had where they put together the Declaration of Sentiments. It's coming. It's just slow. And it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a Sunday afternoon. This is in New York State. This is in upstate. Yep, upstate New York. Yeah, Rochester, New York, not Minnesota. So this was it's a small kind of area. It has where the original building is, where the convention was, the first one. But what I began to see, even at the very beginning of my sabbatical, was the incredible power that women have and had and continue to have. And it gave me so much hope. So not only these women who, against all sorts of odds, stood up and said, something's not right here, and we are intelligent enough to vote. So Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the women that were with them, but also people like Ida B. Wells, who when she was younger, she was an African American from Memphis, who saw friends get lynched and decided that that wasn't okay. And so she started writing about it, and she started telling the stories of the mostly young men who were lynched simply because they were African. And that got death threats. I mean, her house was bombed. She was in Chicago at the time, so she ended up staying in Chicago and continuing her writing. I had always heard her name, but never her story. So Ida B. Wells, Harriet Tubman, we all know Harriet Tubman's story, but to dive deep into her story, we did the Harriet Tubman byway. You go to all these different spots where Harriet Tubman grew up, where she worked, where she started the Underground Railroad, all of these different things to listen and hear the story, the work that she did after the Underground Railroad. She wasn't just a conductor on the Underground Railroad, she was a spy for the Union Army. She worked with women's rights, especially women's rights to vote, helped care for the elderly. We went to one of her homes that she created a place for elderly people to stay. I mean, this woman was amazing, and she did it, and despite all the odds against her. I learned about the women behind the men of the civil rights movement, Coretta Scott King, Miley Edgars, and others who continued the work of their husbands after their husbands were killed. And they just did it. There was very little hesitation in the work that they did and the foresight that they had to continue the work because they knew it was important for their people, for our nation, and for their children. So I really kind of reclaimed my own feminine power and the power that we have as women that often gets squelched. And I was talking a little bit about this today in confirmation. We were talking about some of the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah in particular, of the southern kingdom of Judah. And we were talking about both of them talk to the people of Judah about the ways that they oppress people, the ways that they lie for their own benefit, how they don't care for the poor, how they don't. And we were talking about what are the things that God is calling us out for, and how do we notice that, and how do we change that? And I said, some of what I've learned over the past 3 or 4 months in a much more immersive way than I ever had is that one of the ways that we can do that, one of the most important ways that we can do that, is to listen to the stories of people of color, to listen to the stories of women, and believe those stories. This is nothing new. You've heard me say this before. But the power of those stories put together and then told in a way for us to hear and to see, for me, to immerse myself in that for 6 weeks, really crystallized what I feel I'm called to. But I want to finish my confirmation story. And then, and what I know why this is important is because one of the kids said, well, in a slang I didn't understand, somebody else had to translate for me. So this is about being 50 and teaching 6th and 7th graders. I have no idea what they're saying half the time. But basically what he was saying was women lie. We shouldn't believe them because women lie. And I'm like, no, women don't lie. I mean, maybe there are some, but for the most part, women don't lie, people of color don't lie. And so, 5 minutes, thank you, sir. But that's, I mean, this is a 7th grader, right, saying this. And so that's what is out in the world. That's what people are telling them. Well, they're just lying, right? But that's what people empowered do. If we go back and we look at the story, which the timeline for this started in about the 1500s, things I was learning about, transatlantic slave trade, 1619, to the end of the transatlantic slave trade, to the domestic slave trade, to things like Manzanar and the internment camps of World War II, on to all sorts of different, every point in time, we see people lying so that they can gather power. The people in power telling lies about the people who are not so that they can oppress them. And that has to stop. And the only way that's going to stop is by learning the stories and then telling the stories. There was a moment, this is how I'm going to wrap it up, and I'll be sharing photos in a much better way in the coming months. And if you're in Owls, you'll have a much different presentation in a few months. So, somewhere, and I don't know where it is, because many of the museums I was at didn't allow pictures. And so I don't have a lot of pictures from a lot of the museums I was at. But there was one museum, I'm pretty sure, I don't think it was a book I was listening to because, it could have been, but I wasn't listening to Smarty Pants books. There was only one Smarty Pants book I was kind of sort of reading, and that was this one by John O'Donohue. And you can see I didn't get very far. This is his book about friendship, being friends with yourself and then being friends with others. If you want to read this with me, you can join Coffee with Pastor Karyn during Lent. Anyways, so somewhere along the way, there was a quote that went something like, all of our decisions are held between the sun and the moon. Now that sounds a little wooey, but for me, it's very mystical, and it just hit me in the heart. This idea that every choice that I make is held in the light or the dark. And I can choose to love people, or I can choose to hate people, or I can choose to be indifferent. But whatever I do is held in the life that I live between the sun and the moon. And as I kept hearing these stories of these incredible men and women who never let go of hope, and hearing the stories of the men and the women who did despicable things, because we as human beings have the capacity for both, a refrain from a song by Mumford & Sons that goes, I'm stand here and stick my stake in the ground. It became evident to me over and over and over again that where my stake is going to stand is that I will choose love over and over and over again. That whether I'm in the bright sun of the day and the sun of Christ, I'm going to choose love. And in the darkest times of my life, I'm going to choose love. And that's a little scary because that's not always the easiest thing to do, right? It's much easier sometimes to just turn and look the other way. But to choose love as the way that I'm going to move forward in a deeper way than I had ever really thought about it before, right? It was easy to love the poor or the hungry or fill in the blank that Matthew has for us. But that how I'm going to comport myself in this world is to choose love over and over and over again. Became something that felt much deeper than it ever had before. So I did something that I never thought I would ever do again. And right before I came back, I got a tattoo. It stays on my arm, and it's just, I choose love. And the sun and the moon, E-Rock at Blue Line Tattoos, if you ever need a tattoo, he's the guy you want to go to. And I put it here so that I could see it, whatever I was doing, whether I was baking, whether I was driving, whether I was writing my sermon, whether I was talking to someone in my office, whatever I was doing, I would be reminded that this is what 3 months of being able to step away from a job I absolutely adore, people that I love deeply, and immerse myself in a story of both violence and hope, that I'm going to try everything I can to live in the side of hope. What that looks like for here, and for my work here, is a couple of things. The right to vote is a sacred right. And so everywhere I went, the right to vote was what was always being fought for. So fighting for the right to vote and making sure people who are registered and allowed to vote actually vote. Not telling people how to vote. That's your choice. But making sure that happens is something that I want to do. I can't tell you how to vote, actually. I'd lose my job. So I could be thrown into jail. Not jail, but, fined. So that's one thing. The second thing is to tell the story. So the few times that I've preached, you've heard me telling stories about the people and the places that I've been, because we don't know the stories. And it's a crime that we don't know these stories, that we don't know these men and these women who fought for the sake of others and for their children and for our children and our grandchildren and so on and so forth. It's a crime that we don't know their stories. And so if you look at my pictures, a lot of them are pictures of people's biographies that I saw in some of the various places that I visited. And I'm trying to figure out, I think I'm going to have Dr. Kim help me do this because he's so good at this, create some sort of database so that I can go and pick stories that fit with whatever I'm talking about. And then to probably in 2025, lead a trip that is just a snippet of what I did over the course of 6 weeks, but to take a week and probably Atlanta, Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham, maybe over to Little Rock, or up to Memphis probably, but to lead a trip, to help show you and tell you the stories. That's all the time I have. Jason's like, how much time do you want? 45 minutes, an hour? I'm like, 3. And there are many other stories. Sorry it was a little bit chaotic. technology and I not always getting along. I can't wait to tell you more stories, especially the specific stories of people that I learned about and met. If you have any questions, we have about 10 minutes before the next, if you want to switch, and you can ask me while I try to figure out pictures in order. So, thank you, everybody. Hi, everybody. How you doing? It's okay. I was thinking earlier, when I had that little coughing fit during worship, I'm like, this is the most I've talked in 2 weeks, since Christmas Eve, or since Christmas Day. Like, I've been isolated, I haven't been talking to people, and so my voice, my throat is so dry. And so, yeah, so I started having a little coughing as I was going, but this is the life we live, right? I guess. I don't know. This is the first time I've had COVID, or I had COVID. I no longer have it. I wouldn't be here if I did. So, do you think this is it? I think this might be it. We're going to get started because turns out I have a lot to talk about. I've been having technical issues. So what you're going to see here is 3 slides, and then I'm going to show you a series of pictures. And I've figured out how to show you the pictures in order. The last group got them in all sorts of weird, crazy orders. So hopefully this one will go a little bit better. But as you know, or maybe you don't know, but I think I wrote this in a newsletter article. When I was first trying to think about my sabbatical in 2023, it was in 2022, because we have to submit a proposal to our vision and leadership team about what we want to do. And Pastor Stanton had just talked about the wilderness as a place of learning and knowing yourself and finding yourself. And so I really kind of latched on to that image of sending myself into a wilderness to learn more about not only myself, but the world. And that is exactly what happened. The reality is, at the beginning of my sabbatical, I was burnt out. The pandemic had leached every bit of creativity and energy from me, and there was very little time to take a break after a massive amount of creative output that was required in those first 6 months to a year. And what we know is that when you hit that point of exhaustion and burnout, really the only way to combat that is to step away. And that's exactly what your gift of sabbatical allowed me to do, was to step away and to reconnect. And so a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about is how I connected with not only myself, but with the world, again, in ways that were terribly, deeply meaningful. So, this projector does not like the things I showed, or the background that I chose, so we're going to do the best we can. I thought I'd share some statistics from my trip. I took 4 different trains. I took a train from the Empire Builder from here in La Crosse all the way to Seattle. This happened in September and into the first week of October, so about 5 weeks of travel. And then I took the train from Salem, Oregon, where my cousins live, down to Los Angeles. Then I took a train from LA to Orange County, which was just a few hours. I, for the first time, stayed in business class on Amtrak on this, commuter train thing, and they gave me snacks and everything. It was great. I didn't know they were going to do that, so I brought snacks with me, but I just kept those for another day. It was very nice. I'm like, wow, I should do this more often. And then that was train number 3. And then train number 4 was the California Zephyr from Emeryville to Chicago. That was the longest route. It's pretty much 4 full days. I was ready to get off the train. And I love train travel. So we're going to talk a little bit about train travel and what that did for me. So 4 trains, 3 planes from Seattle to Anchorage, and then Anchorage to Portland with a layover in Seattle. 2 cars, primarily my car, in October and November. But my sister did drive from Orange County to Central California, about 4 hours where she lived. So from where my brother lived to where she had just moved. And then we did some driving around that area. That's when I saw Manzanar, which I talked about back in December. I went to see the Cesar Chavez National Monument and the Rosie the Riveter National Park. So 2 cars, 32 hotels, 2 Airbnbs, 1 sister's house, and 1 cousin's house. I stayed in a lot of different beds. What I discovered, most of those hotels, all but 2, maybe 3, were Marriott hotels, because I get Bonvoy points. I am now a platinum Bonvoy member, and I'm going to get everything I can out of that, because this will be the last time. I mean, I don't travel this much. So I've already used some of my points when I went to California for my sister's birthday. So what I discovered was the pillows that I had at home, which I thought were awesome, were horrible. And I really loved the pillows that Marriott provides for you, so much so that that was one of the top things on my Christmas list. And so I got 2 of those pillows and just got to start using them, because I refused to use them while I was sick. I'm like, there's no way these are going to get any cooties on them. And I'll tell you, I've had really good sleep. So I'm really excited about that. I would like 2 more, though, because I was used to having 4. And so I'm like, this isn't quite right. Anyways. Say what again? They're not my pillows. No. I was in the car for 7,766 miles. Most of that, about 6,800 of that, was when I did the Civil Rights Trail, which I'll talk about in just a minute, in my own car. But my sister did drive. We drove quite a bit. 34 cities, 30 states, 26 museums and libraries, 8 different tours, 28 monuments and historic sites. Some of those were national ones, some of those were not. So I did a lot. And when I look at this, I'm like, wow, I should not be as rested as I am. But what I was able to do, because I was driving and because I was on the train, was while the days had, almost every single day had something going on, there was also lots of time to rest and to relax and to just enjoy life. And I love to travel, so it worked really well. So here's how I propose we talk about this, and we're going to try this again. This didn't work the last time because I couldn't get the pictures to work. I'm going to talk a little bit about Alaska. That was the first place that I went, and it was where I was reminded most deeply how important it is for me to connect to nature. That there is something in me, I don't know if it was because of where I grew up and I was always at the beach or I was always in the mountains, but something in me needs to connect to nature. And I absolutely adore the mountains, which we don't really have here. So that's been something to think about. I'm going to talk a little bit about train travel and how it helped me connect to solitude. I'm going to talk about why Disney is really important to me, why I love it so much, and the connections that I found there. I'm going to talk about my time in Atlanta and how that connected to me to discomfort and the importance of being uncomfortable. Montgomery, also a little bit of Selma and Birmingham in there, talk about connecting to past truth and story. Memphis, I'm going to talk about connecting to heartbreak. In Greensboro, I'll talk a little bit about connecting to hope. And then Hartford and Ithaca, connection to family. And then Seneca Falls and Rochester, connection to feminine strength. And I won't talk just about those particular places, but how I saw that throughout my whole time traveling. That ends the slideshow part of it, but we're going to look at pictures now, if you don't mind. I would like to introduce you, and some of you might have seen this picture. It's my favorite picture from Alaska. The pictures, this projector doesn't like my pictures, but this is Heath. He's a porcupine. I met Heath at one of the Alaska Animal Conservation Centers. I wanted to take him home. We were actually allowed to go into his pen and feed him. I was traveling with Pastor Libby, and the picture she got of me feeding him was just my arm. So you don't need to see my arm, but this is Heath. He was adorable. He only has 3 appendages, so that's why he's there. He's one of 4. They're all named after candy bars. Let's see if this will work the way I want it to. Nope. I couldn't get the pictures to upload into my slideshow. That's why we're doing it this way. But I really remember, this was one of the bears that we saw that just walked up to this log and just laid its head down and took a nap. and I discovered my love for black bears, or bears of any kind, grizzlies primarily we saw there. But what I began to remember about myself and connect to in my connection to nature is my connection for empathy and for this idea that we're all connected, right? Like the way that I choose to treat the environment has an impact on these animals. The way I choose to spend my money, the way I choose to live my life impacts not just me and not just, the people that are my direct resource, but all of these, all of nature. But mostly, what this reminded me of was joy, to connect back to what I've often talked about as my spiritual gift of joy, which in times of great stress tends to be not paid attention to much because I'm just focused on whatever is next, right? So being able to watch these animals in their natural habitat was just pure joy for me. And that was like raining and gross that day. This is the next day, we drove down and went on a tour of the fjords in Alaska. This was towards the end of the season. In fact, it was one of their last tours, boat tours. If you're going to go visit Alaska in September, do it in the first 2 weeks of September, because after that, they cut it off. They told us when we started our tour, we're not sure how much we're actually going to see because it's kind of late in the year. We saw more than they had seen all summer. And so we saw orca whales, we saw porpoises that chased the boat, like would race the boat. And so I remember I was just standing on the edge of the boat laughing because they were just jumping all over. I mean, they were just like you see in the movies. It was so awesome. Seals and otters and birds, puffins, seagulls, and jellyfish. I'd only ever thought of jellyfish in warmer waters, but they have jellyfish in Alaska. So we were back in one of the fjords, and there was this waterfall coming, and so the captain of the boat just we nearly hit the rock. What you don't see in this lower corner, what you can't see because of the water, is there's a little rubber ducky somebody put there, which I just thought was adorable. And so I was standing on the bow of the boat. There was one other person there with me, and just looking straight up and just watching the waterfall fall down. It was magical. It was so amazing. I barely got wet, and then I stepped back because she was getting a little closer, and I didn't want to get wet. And there were a whole bunch of other people on the sides of the boats, like you go down to get inside. And she started backing up, and all the water just went right down those sides of the boats. I felt very smart for not standing there. It was so incredible. We almost didn't make it back to our Airbnb that day because of road construction, but we made it just in time. Had a lovely conversation with a road construction guy who told us all about the spas to go to. This big, burly construction guy, in his construction gear, and it was cold, so he was all bundled up, and he was telling us about spas. I thought it was awesome. So that, I think, is all for Alaska. This is from the train. So when I love train travel. I love it primarily because it's one of the only ways of traveling where you can just sit and you don't have to worry about anything. Everything's done for you. And you can sit and stare out the window for hours and nobody cares, right? You don't have to talk to anybody because most of my family and friends don't like to travel by train, and so I'm often by myself. So what I ended up, and I thought I would be like in the observation car and like talking to my neighbors and being very sociable, and that's not how it happened at all. My little roomette became my cocoon. And I stared out the window and I read. And I did not read make me smarter books, right? I didn't read anything about civil rights that I thought I would read. I didn't read any biographies. I didn't read any self-help book, none of it. I didn't read any of it. I read novels that had no impact on the greater world whatsoever, except that it let my brain escape a little bit and kind of do its own little healing. But I also got to have dinner, breakfast, lunch, and dinner with strangers. And so as much as I was kind of reveling in this solitude and leaning into the introvert side of myself, because if you know anything about Carl Jung and Myers-Briggs stuff, while we all have preferences for things, so I am an extrovert, I prefer extroversion. I know that shocks all of you. In the second half of our life, we tend to lean into that other part of ourselves because we have both. We all are ambiverts, or whatever they're calling it nowadays. But so I've been leaning more into that introverted side, and that's exactly what I needed as at the beginning of my sabbatical. So every morning, every afternoon, every evening, I got to sit and talk to people, perfect strangers. Never knew a single person. Occasionally would have a meal with somebody that I'd had a meal with before. And this was a really great opportunity to just be myself. I did have one very awkward conversation. It happened, we were doing just fine until she asked me the question I hate getting asked, and that is, what do you do for a living? I don't hate that question because I hate my job. I love what I do, but when I do, it automatically has 3 different responses. One, I hear about why they haven't been to church. I don't care. Why they have been to church, or everything they've ever done wrong. It often will shut people down. And so this one woman, this was one of my first times eating with somebody. It was just her and I, and she asked me that question, and she shut down. And nothing I could do could pull information, and I'm good. I'm good at pulling information out. That's like one of my superpowers, and I could not do it. Every other conversation was absolutely sublime. I talked to a Jewish psychologist who wanted to know all about my job and how I navigate it in this day and age. I met a musicologist who is connecting music and computers. Jim, you would have loved talking to this person. And he's just, I was just like, can we talk about Bach? I can talk about Bach in intelligent ways. I met people who were from New Jersey who were traveling the first time. I met 2 women who have known each other their whole lives and live in different places but came together to do this train ride. I just met all these interesting people. And turns out they found me interesting as well. It always surprises me. Because I don't get a lot of time to talk to perfect strangers. That's just not something that happens often in my life. 1, 2, 3, let's see. I should be keeping track of all of these, but I'm not. There's a train. We often had time to get out and walk around, so I got to see all sorts of small towns, big towns. But that was one of the cars that I traveled on. This was a view from a window on the train as we were going down the California coast this was outside of Santa Barbara. I was on the wrong side of the train, except that the person across from me left, like in Santa Barbara or something. And so my room attendant, the car attendant, was like, hey, Karyn, pop over there so you can see the sunset. And so I did. I sat in the other car for a little while and watched the sunset. It was absolutely gorgeous. I think there's nothing more that I love than watching the sunset over the ocean. I think that's a gift from my childhood. And it's just so gorgeous. This was from the train. We're going through the mountains. It's so beautiful. The high plains. This was on the California Zephyr. We were in Colorado. The colors were changing. The river was beautiful. You can't see quite the contrast of the colors, but This was when I was with the two girls who had grown up together but lived in different, and all we were doing, I mean, we were chatting, but we were just taking pictures the whole time, all through lunch. Disney. So I, for the first time in a really long time, went to Disneyland with my siblings and their family. My brother-in-law wasn't there, but that's my brother John, who is looking so handsome and dapper now. I'm like, you are not the brat I knew you to be. And then me, and then right behind me is Ziva, my niece. Next to her is my sister-in-law Andrea. Behind her is my sister Tracy, and then over there is my niece's best friend. They've known each other their whole lives. That's Jasmine. And this was a gift from me to my niece to take us all to Disneyland, and we spent the whole day together, and it was absolutely magical. What I love about Disney is the ways that they figure out how to connect people to each other and to, like, whatever group you're in, connect us to story, and connect us to one another. One of my most favorite things to do at Disney is to watch the fireworks show, because you're all crammed together on Main Street, although we didn't watch it on Main Street, we watched it somewhere else this last time. I didn't like it as much. But anyways, and you're all just entranced by this amazing story that's being told. Or to be on Space Mountain, this is the one where it happens the most because that scares the bejesus out of you. And you're all just there, connected in your joint adventure / fear. You know, there's just these connections that you make with people that are like that, but are just so needed and integral to who we are as human beings. And Disney does it better than anybody. I think the church can learn a lot from Disney. When we had to figure out how to, and then connections, again, just with my siblings, we're having a lot of fun connecting as adults. We're all really successful right now, and my sister is off at pastry school, my brother is doing amazing things in the UC system, and I'm here, one of the best churches in our area, so we're all just in really good places, and so we're really connecting about what we want in life. And my brother took us on a walk, which turned out to be a hike, in flip-flops. I said, Jonathan, you need to warn a girl. I was in a maxi dress and flip-flops, but we went up, and what you can't really see in this picture is, in the background is a vista of Orange County, because he works at UC Irvine, and they have hills, and you can go this hill, and you can just see, it's pretty incredible. So, connections. So I spent time in Atlanta. When I got back from the West Coast, I came back here, spent a couple days here, got into my car, and drove south. And this was a part of the Civil Rights Trail. I used a book, which I forgot to grab this morning, but that gave me an itinerary to work my way through most of the Civil Rights Trail. It didn't do everything, but it did a good chunk of it. And what I loved about this particular book was it not only told me places to go, but it gave me, the important historical places, but modern places, restaurants owned by African Americans, stores owned by African Americans, clubs, to go and enjoy some music. So it wasn't just learning about the heavy history, but learning about the culture and the history and the current life of African Americans as a part of this Civil Rights Trail. So it started in Charleston. Charleston was it was kind of strange, because it's very much, not that any of the other cities aren't, but for some reason it just felt like this, but it's very much a tourist town. It is a destination, a worldwide destination right now. And so there's all sorts of things there that you can see and participate in. And so it wasn't until I got to Atlanta. So most of the stuff, I should start in Charleston. Most of the stuff that I did in Charleston was, I went to places like the Old Slave Mart and to the Trading House, which that's not what it's called, and went to those civil rights places. Like, this is where the transatlantic slave trade was really bustling, and then the domestic slave trade that happened after that, also very bustling, and this was a center for that. And so learning all about that, but then everywhere else around me is, all the kind of Charleston Southern beautiful mansion kind of things as well. And so I felt like I was kind of out of step with most of the people that were there, because I wasn't looking necessarily at those things. I was looking at the stuff about the slave trade. There was one, the old slave mart, I couldn't stay at very long. I can often feel a place, if that makes any sense. Like, the history of a place can sometimes weigh on me, and that happened there as I was reading statistics about the people and how much they cost and all those things, and I could just feel the terror and the trauma that happened there. So I didn't actually spend very much time there, and then I went to a rooftop bar and had lunch and a drink, and I felt better. But that's how I started my trip. It wasn't until I got to Atlanta that I began to find myself very much other, because I was purposely putting myself in African American spaces. So one of the first things that I didn't do, this was probably the city where I departed from the suggested itinerary the most, because I had done most of the things that a person who is going to Atlanta for civil rights stuff would do initially, but I'd already done all of those things, like the civil and human rights place, all the Martin Luther King Jr. places. I'd already done most of those. But one of the things suggested that you could do, in addition, was a bus tour that looked at the Black experience in Atlanta, which focused not only on civil rights and the civil rights movement that happened in Atlanta, but then also what has happened since then and what is going on now. So we went to the home of the birthplace of Martin Luther King Jr., which I think there's a picture coming up here pretty quickly, and the Tyler Perry Studios. I know very little about Tyler Perry except for the Big Mama movie, like the kind of the comedic part of him. What I didn't know was how incredibly generous he is, and all the amazing work that he's been doing, not only through his studios, but through his own, using his own money to restore lots of neighborhoods in and around his studios in Atlanta. And it's pretty phenomenal what he's been doing. So this is John Lewis. So I took a bus tour, and Omar was our bus leader, our tour leader and bus driver. It was a little bus. There were 8 of us. 6 of them were paired off. 2 of us were not. Michael was my seatmate. I was the only white person. And I was like, okay, you're in it, and I just kept reminding myself, listen more than you talk, listen more than you talk. And so I began to feel, there were moments where I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. Most of those had to do about pop culture, because I don't live in that world, and we certainly don't get a lot of African American pop culture here in La Crosse. However, when I got there and I was getting on the bus and Omar was checking me in, he said, "Welcome, family." And I learned that is how African Americans continue to help build what they call the beloved community, which is the community, the worldwide community of people that come together in love and in working for justice and love in the world. This was something that Martin Luther King and a large part Coretta Scott King built up as part of the King Center. And there was just something about that just welcomed me in. So as much as I felt other, I also felt as a part of it. I never once felt like I was just ignored in that. They were always talking to me. I had great conversations with Michael and some of the other folks on our tour when they found out I was a pastor. And this happened multiple occasions, especially with African American men. When they found out I was a pastor, they celebrated. They were thrilled. They were complimentary. I don't get that with white people. I get confusion with white people oftentimes. A lot of people that were on this tour were social workers or teachers, But we drove around Atlanta all day. It was awesome. I loved every minute of it. And we saw murals, and we saw places, and we learned about people. And this is probably, this is me in front of Martin Luther King's birthplace. This was early on in the tour, and we were already like a tight-knit group that was making sure we got pictures of everybody around. This is just down from the King Center and from Ebenezer Baptist Church, the new and the old. So the one that Dr. King was a part of is a smaller church that's on the corner. And then across the street, they've built the new building, which is beautiful and big. And right there is the Dr. King's National Park as well. And then this is just not too far from there. So we did get to see some of those things. Come on. You can do it. Nope, that's it. Oh, Karyn. Okay. This was Tyler Perry's studios. We weren't allowed to go in, sadly. We had to stand outside. But I got to learn all about all the things that Tyler Perry is doing, the ways that he's using his money to better Atlanta. The other thing that I learned on this tour, which I knew in the back of my head, but I saw for myself as I was going through all the cities of the Civil Rights Trail, in all the major cities, I saw this happening. And what happens in a lot of metropolitan areas in the 1960s especially is that when the highways were built, when the interstates were built, they were often built through communities of color. And if it wasn't a highway, it was a stadium. And so one of the things that Tyler Perry is trying to do is to rebuild some of those communities. But I saw this in Atlanta, I saw it in Montgomery, in Birmingham, in Memphis, in Nashville, every city that I went to. If I was in a black neighborhood, there was an interstate somewhere bisecting that neighborhood, and took what happens when that happens, when you divide a neighborhood by an interstate, is it destroys that neighborhood. And so vibrant, beautiful African-American neighborhoods where people were business owners and were wealthy and were like thriving were destroyed. And that wasn't on accident. So I was really impressed with Tyler Perry, and I look forward to learning more about him. I think this is the Tyler, yep. Oh, I can tell I'm getting tired. Okay, here we go. So that was Atlanta. From Atlanta, I moved to Selma. This is the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Selma was eye-opening to me. They had experienced a tornado a year maybe before I got there. But even before that, they were economically depressed city. Their downtown was decimated, which shocked me given its importance in our national history. This is where the fight for civil rights and for voting rights really happened. So I did eventually walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. This was from my hotel room. I stayed at this historic hotel there in Selma. But then I went to Montgomery, and I went to this place. And this is probably, for me, the most impactful museum that I went to. You saw how many museums and historical places I went to. This is probably the one that was the most important place for me to go to. This is where next year I will lead a trip, and we will go there. This will be the kind of the cornerstone, the center of what we do together. This is the Legacy Museum in Montgomery. It's called the Legacy Museum from Enslavement to Mass Incarceration. So this was the first place that I went where I began to get a sense of the scope of the life of African Americans in our country, starting from 1619, from the transatlantic slave trade all the way up until 2020. What I loved about this particular museum and what I learned on my trip was that not all museums are created equally, But this museum was probably the best because it engaged every single one of my senses. And so as I walked in, my sight and sound, there was pictures of ocean and sounds of the ocean, and then walked into another room where there were sculptures on the side to represent all those who were lost on the transatlantic voyage, the Middle Passage, they called it. And then it just continued from there. At one point, there was, when they were talking about domestic slave trade, there were like cells, and you would walk in front of the cell, and they would have almost like a holographic image of a person telling their story. And at first, I was like, I'm going to go listen to every single one of them, and I got through 2. And I just couldn't do it anymore because they were so heartbreaking. To hear these stories that we never hear. And then there was another part where you just got to go through and read. Like some museums, that's all you do. I don't like those museums, I discovered. But then you just read about what would happen, what happened to African Americans and other people of color throughout kind of the 18 and 1900s. There was another room where there were jars of sand from every place, almost every place, where there was a lynching. So to see that was just incredible. So the Legacy Museum is also the place that has created the National Monument for Peace and Justice, what is more commonly known as the Lynching Museum. So this is one side that you see here. And it starts out, and it's all of them, like if I was walking along here, they're all like kind of at eye level, right? And then you walk around, and on each pillar represents a county where their lynchings have occurred. And then there are lists of the people, if they knew their names. Otherwise, it just said unknown and the date. So you would see those. But as you walked around, so you entered from the side here, and you could walk there, or you walk down. You could walk in among them, or on the side at this point. But then, eventually you start walking down and in, and they're above you, and it's getting darker. And you can still see the names on the bottom. What you see on the side are the stories of the people and why they were lynched. And what you begin to realize is and I think I talked about this at some sermon, maybe it was Christmas morning, I don't remember now, the incredible depth of violence that a human soul can hold within it. Because the reasons for these lynchings, and when I was eventually in the Mississippi Delta and learned more about Emmett Till's story, same horrific stuff, right? It's nothing. It's things that we would just walk away from mostly today. Not always, right? Some people don't, but so you walk down and down and then around, and then there's just this wall of water. This was the centerpiece of my time on the Civil Rights Trail, mostly because it gave me a really in-depth overview of the whole movement. And so every other museum I went to, it was basically just reinforcing kind of what I'd already learned, and then maybe specific to like Birmingham when I was in Birmingham, or Memphis, or wherever I was. But also I'm a visual person. And so to have this visual of violence and death that white people perpetuate against black people was very powerful for me. I don't think I have a picture. This wasn't the only thing that they had there. Then each one of those, nope, that's my friend from Birmingham. I'll talk about her in just a second. But so each one of those that were hanging They then put them down on the ground like coffins. And so you walked through like rows and rows of these, brown coffin-shaped things that had the lists of names. And there were counties from every single state in our country where lynchings had occurred. And I remember going through and I looked for specific places. I just talked to a friend about Illinois, so I was looking for Illinois. I was looking for California because that's where I was, and I never thought there were issues in California. It was silly of me, but I was young. And then I turned the corner and there's a whole bunch more. It wasn't all downers. They also have a project where they're trying to get people to talk about these things. And so they had a whole section that showed all the different counties that are talking about these lynchings and trying to be better and trying to implement programs that help understanding and deepen understanding. So it wasn't just all, the Legacy Museum does not take any government money. And the reason they don't take any government money is because they want to be able to tell the story in a way with integrity and not have the government tell them that they can't do that. And so they're completely privately funded, and they're quite well funded. If you ever are in Montgomery, you must go. Or join my trip next year sometime, and we'll do that. After Montgomery, I went to Birmingham. This was at the 16th Street Baptist Church, and went and toured there. This is their sanctuary. This was my tour guide. I was the only person there. This happens when you travel in the fall, and you set up tours in the middle of the week. Nobody's there, and so you get an opportunity to talk to people in amazing ways. And so I had this lovely conversation with her and talked to her about young people, because at this point I had been, and I think I have a picture, across the street in the park where the kids, so in Birmingham, there were all sorts of horrible things going on in Birmingham. That's where probably one of the most evil men that lived during that time was not the police commissioner, he was like a commissioner in charge of public safety or something. Bull Durham, not Durham. Anyways, I'll remember his name later this afternoon, but was doing horrible things. This is where dogs and hoses were used against children, because the children were the ones who were marching after their parents couldn't do it because they would lose their jobs. So the kids decided to march. And they marched. The 16th Street Baptist Church is here, and the park is right across the street. And that's where, when you see pictures of these things, that's the park that it happened, the Kelly Ingram Park. And so it was very surreal for me to be there, because I had seen so much of the footage. And then to be in that place and to bring up those images was very bizarre to me, very surreal. But so I was asking her about young people and how they're involved now and what the church is doing in terms of civil rights and the work that they've continued, and had an amazing conversation with her about all of those things. She found out I was a pastor, so she was asking me all about what we were doing. And that picture, that window, I think I included. Nope, I didn't. That window was gifted to them by their sister church in Denmark, maybe. And so it's kind of it's beautiful picture of Christ, and so they are very proud of that, and it's a key image for them as they continue to do their work. So after Montgomery, Selma, Birmingham, I went to Little Rock. Bull Connor, thank you. I don't ever want to be in those kinds of pictures that had Bull Connor and his ilk. I always want to be in the other pictures. That's kind of the line I've drawn. I'm like, I feel for his descendants. I'm like, I don't know I'd love to know more about them. So I went to Little Rock. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. I wasn't there very long. But then I went to Memphis. And of course, Memphis is where Lorraine Hotel is. That's where Dr. King was killed. The night before Dr. King was killed, he was scheduled to speak at a church. It was a horrible night, horrible rainstorms. They didn't think anybody was going to show up. And so he was not planning on going. Abernathy was there instead. They get there, it's a packed house. And so Abernathy calls King and says, you have to come down here. So King comes and gives a speech that's largely off the cuff. And this is the mountaintop speech that we know. It was his last speech. And in that speech, he, of course, has been receiving death threats most of his adult life, right? But there seems to be something that he knew was going to happen, because he talks about, I've been on the mountaintop and I'm not afraid to die, right? It gives me chills even now. I encourage you to listen to it. He goes back to Lorraine Motel and then is in really, really good spirits, and then is assassinated from across the street. There was construction, so you can't see it really well, but it's not that terribly far. They've created a civil rights museum that is done in conjunction with the Smithsonian, probably my second favorite museum that I went to. But I think I have a closer picture. Nope. So the reason that he was there in Memphis is because there was a public worker strike, the sanitation workers, who were in such horrible conditions that they were dying, that men were being killed. And so they had tried to do a march that turned violent. And so this was their second attempt at such a march. And so he was there to kind of lead that. And of course, then he ends up dying. He ends up getting assassinated. But that whole movement was, I am a man. Like, I am a human being, and we deserve better treatment. And so we see Dr. King's fight for civil rights not just about voting rights for African Americans, but to be much larger. And what I think it's missed so much in the story of Dr. King is that his calling to be a Christian is embodied in his fight for everyone to have humane treatment and to be fully appreciated for the human beings that they are. And that's what we see here in Memphis. At the museum, they really bring to life that last day of his life. And you can walk into the rooms. They're exactly the way they were when he died. But you can hear the conversations that he was having. There's some recordings there, some recreations. You know, he was getting ready to have a meal. He was walking out to have a cigarette. And then the anguish that you hear. And that, I mean, I'd been doing this for a couple weeks by this point, and that's when the real heartbreak of what white people especially did to black people and continue to do to black people really kind of weighed on me. I was kind of, you know how in museums you kind of go back and forth with people and you kind of travel with each other, and especially when they're that kind of directed. I was with two African American women, and all three of us were weeping. Like, there was no not weeping at what was happening there, and what you could kind of, when you see his hotel room with his phones and his meals and all of that kind of stuff, you couldn't get away from it. And I used to work in the medical field, and I remember being taught to kind of separate yourself a little bit so that you don't get too emotionally involved. And I've kind of sort of connected with that, but then I kind of disconnected from that again. And so stoicism and intellectualism kind of won out the day. But really what especially this Memphis, helped me do was reconnect to the depth of my empathy that I carry within me, that helps explain a lot of my heartbreak over the last 4 or 5 years. And so that's a really important part for me to claim for my own. This is an I Am a Man plaza. This was one of the churches that Dr. King was working with that was a part of the I Am the Man March. Then I went to Nashville. Nashville rained the whole time, so I did more driving tours than walking tours. I've totally gone over, but I'm almost done. And so Nashville I ended up going to the Parthenon, and just kind of, it was almost a palate cleanser for me, Nashville. Had some really good barbecue. And then I went to Greensboro. And of course, Greensboro is the home of the lunch counter movement. And this is where I remembered hope. And of course, I've heard stories of hope throughout my time. That's the only way this could be going on. The fight for justice could be going on for over 400 years, right? Like, to have hope. And so I went to the International Civil Rights Museum in Greensboro to learn all about the lunch counter. And of course, for the first part of the tour, I was the only person there. By the end, there were like 5 other people. But I, again, got to have this amazing conversation with the women tour guide about kind of the history of civil rights and asking her some questions that I hadn't had a chance to ask. But learning about these 4 men and then putting that together with stories I had heard in some of the other cities about the lunch counter movement that was happening there, and really beginning to understand the strength and the hope that these young people especially held in their hearts, and their willingness to just go for it. And to just, when I was in Atlanta many years ago, they have a simulation of the lunch counter. It lasts about a minute. I thought for sure it was 5. I told myself I wasn't going to move until it was over. It was the longest minute of my life, where you can hear and feel what it was like to sit at one of those lunch counters. And the violence that was coming at these young people was incredible. Like, I wouldn't have been able to do it. But they did. So all they wanted was a cup of coffee. So this is outside the Woolworth, the original one, where these 4 gentlemen sat down for the first time. And so hope was born again, and I'm like, I can do stuff. After that, I was in D.C., and I met my parents there, and then we went on to, we spent 4 days in D.C., and we went to the Frederick Douglass House, which you should go to, but be warned, it's 87 stairs to get up to the house. There is a ramp that you can, a much gentler ramp, but regardless of which way you choose, give yourself plenty of time. But I loved hearing the story, more depth of Frederick Douglass. And that's really what I learned at all these different places that I went, was the depth of these people that we kind of heard about here and there, but like their full story. Frederick Douglass was also, let me see if I can find the picture I want. I knew this was going to go way over. That was my life for 4 days. As we did family history, you were given green paper and only allowed a pencil. That's the Brown Family Cemetery we were finally able to get to. We're almost there. Let's see. This was in Seneca Falls. This was at the first meeting place for the Women's Convention, where the Declaration of Sentiments was. What I didn't know about Frederick Douglass was that he lived in Rochester for quite a long time, and that's actually where he's buried. And so he actually was very key in the fight for women's rights to vote. The right to vote is what most of these fights were in the civil rights movement, and continue to be, is for people to have the right to vote, to have power over who makes the decisions for us. And of course, we've seen that play out a lot, and continue to see that play out. What's this last picture? I don't know. Oh, right. So, in conclusion, one of the things, when I was at one of the museums somewhere where I wasn't allowed to take pictures, which happened a lot, there was a quote that said something like, all our decisions are held between the sun and the moon, which is a very mystic thing to think, which is actually like my wheelhouse. I love this kind of mysticky things. But as I began to think about that, and they were especially talking about the choice to love. Like, that choice is held in this nature place, so we're back to nature. But as I began to think about that through the lens of my faith, like in times of light and in times of dark, I have a choice of how I'm going to choose to live. And the more I heard stories of hope and stories of violence and the stories that we as human beings are going to be together, the more and more I began to feel a deep need, deeper than any other time of my life, to put my stake in the ground on the side of love. That no matter what situation I find myself in, it is always going to be my intent to choose the way of love. Whether that's the easy way or the not so easy way, which most times it's the not so easy way, right? But I wanted something that was going to, like, stick it somewhere where it wasn't going to go anywhere, right? And so I got a tattoo right before I came back. I had something completely different in mind, but when I went to go see E-Rock at Blue Line Tattoos, I highly recommend, if you ever want to get a tattoo, he's the guy to go to. He's like, Karyn, if you want me to do that, it's going to take up your whole arm. And I'm like, well, I don't want anything that's going to take up my whole arm, although this takes up quite a bit of it. So he created this sun and moon design, and then I choose love. And I just love it. And I wanted it here so that no matter what I was doing, whether I was baking in my kitchen, whether I was reading a book, whether I was typing out a sermon, writing a newsletter article, talking with friends, having drinks, I would always see this. Working out, sure, yeah. Doing curls in my basement, while I'm walking on the treadmill that I haven't used in 6 months, that I would always see that. And I would always remember what I had learned in this immersive experience of this storyline that I've not ever immersed myself in before, even though this kind of stuff has been kind of stuff I've wanted to learn about. So that's the gift of this sabbatical. My hope is to work for voting rights here at so as I'm coming back and I'm thinking about how this is going to change how I'm going to do, to make sure that everybody who can vote can and does. I'm not going to tell you how to vote because I'll lose my job and get fined by the government. But even though that doesn't happen to other people, but for some reason I'm a white woman preacher. So, and then the second thing is to tell the story. So you'll hear lots of stories from me. I have hundreds of pictures of people that I want to learn more about. And so I'm trying to figure out how to create a database where I can kind of like have tag words, or whatever. I'm hoping Eddie Kim will help me with that because he's really good at that stuff. And then I will, next year at some point, do a little mini version, not a 6-week version, but a mini version of the Civil Rights Trail, probably Atlanta, Selma, Birmingham, Montgomery, and maybe up to Memphis. So that'll happen next year. We're going to maybe do a dry run this year, but yeah, to help bring people to the places that I were, where I could hear and tell and feel the story. So, questions?
I just have a comment. I had the opportunity in the World War to meet one of the gentlemen who's a good friend of mine.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He's got a daughter with him.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It was pretty powerful. I did walk over the bridge one morning, and did I tell this group that? Or I can sometimes sense the feelings of a place, and that was one of where I could just feel the passion and the emotion of that time. They did 3 walks over before they finally, the third one they got all the way to Montgomery, but it was pretty powerful to walk over that bridge. And it's the main road into town, so I was like driving along, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, this is it. Like I just imagined, I don't know, enshrined or something. I don't know what I thought it would be, but it was really surprising me. Yeah, so yeah, I would love to talk with her. I hadn't planned on that. I was just going to do something here from the church and invite anybody who wants to come to be a part of it. Some of the things that are rolling around in my head in Atlanta is to do a tour with Omar. He was amazing. And then to do the Legacy Museum, some of the things in Birmingham, to go to the Lorraine Motel, walk over the bridge in Selma. Yeah, so all sorts of interesting, there's all sorts of ideas bubbling. So I have a couple, at least a week, maybe a week and a half, maybe 2, I don't know yet. That's what my friends are helping me figure that out, so. Any other questions? No. Thanks for being here, thanks for being attentive. I knew I wasn't gonna get through everything, huh? Oh, you're welcome. If you come to Owls when I present, it'll be completely different. Or you'll hear some of the same stories, but it'll be a little different than this. So, stupid technology. I'll definitely be bringing a lot of other different things. This was my journal, my travel journal. So this was with me. It has pictures and notes and things. And if anybody knows Doctor Who, this is the journal that they have to compare. Anyways, yeah. This was the book that accompanied me. I haven't finished reading it. Again, I didn't read any make me smarter books. I read novels. But this is, Coffee with Pastor Karyn will read this during Lent, so, yeah. I'm the new one. Oh, right. I want to see the new movie, yeah. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's coming out as a remake already. Makes me feel old. All right. Take care, everybody. Thanks for staying longer than needed.